What if your greatest passion led you down a path of unimaginable darkness? In today's episode, we journey through the tragic tale of George, a man driven by his love for history and thirst for recognition. As his initial success spirals into obsession, he uncovers secrets that push the boundaries of his sanity. Welcome to Tales from the Cryptkeeper, and this is Blood and Snow by Sinclair. Professor Henshaw's friend George looked, in his own words, just like a hamster. Currently, he looked like a very aggrieved, very annoyed hamster, because Henshaw was trying to talk him out of it. They had met 2.5 years before. George was from what he described as a dump in the Midlands. He worked in a dead-end job in the records department of the town council. His secret passion was for history. All his spare time was devoted to it. He had lots of spare time, lots of empty hours. George had been writing a book. It was all about the life of Sir Thomas Malory. As a self-taught person, he had been having difficulties translating and understanding some of the source material. When he wrote to people in the colleges, he'd been dismissed out of hand. He was just a despised armchair history buff. Also, not the right sort. The return address illustrated this clearly. It was only when he wrote to Andrew Henshaw that he got anywhere. Henshaw had asked if he could have a look at the manuscript. George had immediately gotten on a bus and come down to Oxford. The book wasn't just good, it was brilliant. They had a long talk. It had been interesting. Henshaw had been pleasantly surprised. Like lots of geniuses, he often found other people intensely boring. George and Henshaw had also instantly hit it off. The little man from a dump in the Midlands said he was the perfect person for you and your lady friend to go to the pub with. We'll have loads to drink quickly, have a quick chat, and I'll bugger off. He had been a man of his word. He even got on with Henshaw's girlfriend, Mary. George had gotten the help he needed, and a year later his dream had come true. He got published. This had not only pleased Henshaw because he liked George, it also pleased him because of how annoyed it made some of the historians at the university. Those who he considered insufferable, boring snobs, their rage had been delicious. The little man from a place they intended never to visit had not only written a good book, but he had also actually discovered the probable identity of one of Malory's mistresses. Things like that were not supposed to happen. It wasn't cricket. Henshaw was delighted. They had gotten gloriously drunk at the launch party. Mary, who was not only stunningly beautiful but stunningly clever in her own right, had given George a full-on snog. Henshaw had laughed uproariously as George nearly fainted. "I think she liked your book, George." "You mustn't try and publish this, George." Henshaw had said this flatly, finally. "If you do, they're going to pin you to the wall. I don't have to say what by. Then knock the wall down with you under it. Cover it over and forget you." This was why George looked like an angry hamster at the present time. Henshaw had gallantly ploughed on over his sputtered, indignant, "I thought I would have at least had your support, Andrew," and other protests. He'd got him to shut up, got him another large whiskey, got himself another. He needed it. George was still angry and hurt, but at least he was presently quiet. He was almost biting his lower lip with his big buck teeth, and his cheeks were even redder than usual, but at least he was quiet. George happened to be sitting in the same chair a man called Caputo would sit in over 30 years later, although not in Oxford. Henshaw continued, "I don't care if I sound patronizing. Frankly, I wouldn't bother to reason with you if I didn't think you were intelligent enough to understand that this is a mistake." Here he pointed at the manuscript and notes George had proudly given him a week before. Professor Henshaw had begun reading with interest what would hopefully be George's second book. This soon turned to horrified dismay, often punctuated by consternation and laughter. Said laughter interspersed with sad observations like, "Poor old George has gone off his rocker, and he's what my old Scottish granny would have called know the full shilling." It was a bit tragic, in his opinion. He went on, "You're not stupid, George. You know how stuff like this works. This kind of thing ends up in the mind, body and spirit section. The hippies love it, and you also know how it's usually done." Here George tried to again protest. Henshaw wouldn't let him. "What they do is, they think up what the Americans used to call the dope, the hook, what Hitchcock calls the MacGuffin. Then they pretend to discover it. You and I could run one off. Let's say we made the hook. Big JC survived the crucifixion and fled to what's now France, and his tomb's located in these particular froggy hills. Then we offer theories, but present the theories as evidence. That's always at the core of why it's a big fat load of rubbish. We stick in some stuff about the Knights Templar, got to. The nutters love them. Always pronounce the word Templar with some extra letter L's. For seasoning, add some stuff about how there are more than 4 Gospels, and mention that none of the canon ones were even written by the disciples of those names. All perfectly true, of course, but it gives a thrill of naughtiness to the kind of reader who's secretly afraid of Mrs. Whithouse and the Festival of Light People, and his mum. Someone as empty-headed as we both know the churches will be in 20 years' time. Then stick some black and white photos in the middle, castles in silhouette, some Kabbalistic stuff, that kind of thing. Bit of Renaissance painting maybe. Finally, the slightly ominous title, The Secret of the Holy Place. Professor Henshaw gulped down his whiskey. And the saddest thing is, I know that's not what you've done, George, but it's what you'll be accused of, and they'll finish you. Now George did speak, there was no stopping him at this point. At least you give me that, Andrew. At least that. Do you know how hard I worked on that? I worked harder on that than the first one. Here it was his turn to point at his manuscript. And it wasn't easy. Look at me, Andrew. Do you think anything's ever been easy for me? And what's more, the work's sound. I'm right. Henshaw could hear the pain in the man's voice. This was bad. Really bad. He thought tears were even possible. It was embarrassing. He had some more whiskey, poured George some more. George ignored it. Henshaw held his head in his hands. Bent over his desk, he said, "Let's lay the old cards on the table, shall we?" "Can we do that, George? Painful as it is?" George nodded. "You've written a book in which you claim that not only was Snow White based on a real woman, but that you've identified who she really was, the actual source of the, I'll be generous here, folktale. And according to you, it's not the usual type of thing, German princess. Her dad using child labor in the mines, 20 kids in one dormitory house. Oh no, you make the claim that she was none other than, wait for it, Vipsania of Alexandria, the wife of the 3rd century Christian heresiarch Arius. You've even come up with an explanation for other parts of the story." George nodded. Henshaw held up a hand, his head still lowered. He grasped a handful of his hair with the other hand. Quietly, he said, "And here's the thing, George, it's not even a good hook. The only ones who'll care are you and the people who'll ruin you. No one else will care. The theologians here at the colleges will care, and if that's not a good recommendation not to do it, nothing is. That vicious lot are irrelevant. Take their own washing in and out, except for the damage they'll do you, with the willing help of some of my dear colleagues, and they don't even think Arius came up with all that second person not co-equal with the first boring Trinity nonsense in the first place anymore. But it will get worse. Your average man or woman on the street won't even understand the reference or care to. They don't even think of that lot who don't drink coffee or the ones they tell to go away when they come to the door during match of the day as modern Aryans, and they'll just laugh at the Snow White bit. At this point, I'm begging you, George, let me help you do a rewrite. There's some good material here. We do a thing about European folklore. I'm even willing to put my name on along with yours. Publish this as it is. You're finished. My reputation will survive our original association. Because I'm me, I'm being honest, so you don't accuse me of being patronizing, in the hope that you'll believe me when I say for the last time, you won't survive this." George leaned over and turned the pages of his notes over slowly to a particular page. His hand shook very badly. There was an enlarged black and white photograph attached to it with a paperclip. It was an image of a flat stone slab or pillar on which there was a crumbling but still legible inscription. The thing was jaggedly broken along the middle. At least half, probably more, looked to be missing. It looked as if it had been set into part of a crumbling, ivy-covered wall. "Did you even look at this, Professor Henshaw? This is the missing half of one of the fragments in the Ely Codex. I know that's what this is. As you yourself have stated, Saint Gregory of Tours is the probable author. Of the part that's already recognized, also it's unmistakably an edict of anathema." Henshaw doesn't try and interrupt him. He thinks it's best for him to get it out of his system. Then it might be possible to reason with him, although he increasingly doubts it. The known part says, "Let the left eyes of those who could not see the truth be plucked out. Let the tongues of those who spread his evil lies be torn out. The false priests who spread the words of Arius, that wicked man. Let the feet of those who would not stand upon to solid ground be with massy hammers broken. Let the legs of those who would not walk the straight and narrow path be cut off. Let the right hands of those who wrote and repeated the filthy lies of that accursed man be burned off. Let the of ears those that would not hear the truth of the Holy Trinity. I found the rest, the part that was missing on that stone in a ruined church in Bavaria. I had some luck for once. A local who was keen on my book had been corresponding with me, put me onto it, although he didn't know what was on it, just that it was sometimes called the White Lady Stone. I'd also employed a kind of cutting bureau to gather information in the region. They turned up some hints, lots of old folk tales, the wicked dwarf who lost his hand, Hans the liar who lost his tongue, other things. So I went there myself. Professor Henshaw, this is the missing part of the fragment in the Ely Codex. George read from his manuscript. Henshaw thought again, this is bad. He's starting to ramble. The booze is hitting him. Let the ears of those that would not hear the truth of the Holy Trinity, that the second person is co-eternal and co-equal with the first, be torn off. The 7 false priests who accompanied the mother of lies into the lands of the Germans. She who was her evil husband's helpmate. She who would have helped him to lead the whole world to perdition, and who fled to escape justice, but could not escape the holy servants of the one true Catholic Church. Servants of the Queen of Heaven, fairest of them all, although she, evil witch, had already seduced many. Let not the earth receive her. Let her shame be seen in a high place, amongst eternal snow. Let the sign of the sin of Eve be in her mouth, forever. Henshaw hadn't believed him, had said that bits of the Latin were highly ambiguous and that he'd filled in several worn places with what he'd thought should be there, objected in multiple ways. Finally, there had been lots of shouting, and George had started to storm out. Henshaw had tried to put a restraining hand on his shoulder. For a moment, George had looked up at him and seen not what he currently thought of as an arrogant Oxford Don, but also the big salt-of-the-earth Yorkshire man who was his friend. For a moment he almost sat down, then his anger and humiliation, with a lifetime of different anger and humiliation behind it, asserted itself. He grabbed his manuscript and notes, staggering, and blundered out of the house. His tears were flowing now. Blubbering, he thought to himself. For his part, in later years, Henshaw resolutely refused to think about that night as much as possible, particularly when his own work was increasingly questioned. He never saw George again. Now George was even more drunk, much more drunk. George had long considered himself an expert on friendship because for most of his life, he hadn't ever had any. Like most people in his position, his knowledge came from having gotten close sometimes. They weren't your friends if they started to mock, bully you and condescend to you. This had happened to him many times, nor could you be a project, or worse, a charity case. This had also happened to him, and it was definitely even worse. He had once encountered a girl and thought that romance was even possible. It had turned out she wanted to save him for the Lord. When he angrily told her about how men in pointy hats had once voted on the Lord's divinity in a place in what was now Turkey, she had fled. He knew that Henshaw and his girlfriend Mary, with whom George was in love in a reasonable, none-deluded way, had really been his friends. They had admired his book. Also, he instinctively knew they would have openly told him they didn't want to socialize with him if they didn't want to. People like them wouldn't pretend to be polite. Now, all that lay in ruins. And there was worse. Having always hated his 9-to-5 jobs, George had quit his last one when his book was published. This was the 70s, and people like him were not used to getting the kind of lump sum he'd been given, not to mention the promised royalties. It had gone to his head. Later, he realized it wasn't going to be enough, that if he didn't get another book out, he was going to have to go back to the 9-to-5. He would have to sit in a canteen, exhausted and miserable, with the kind of people who thought the black and white minstrel show was good entertainment, who despised him. Once he had worked alongside a man called Simon Beale, back in the 60s. Being in the man's presence had, for some unknown reason, always made George want to upchuck his last dinner all over the place. Although everyone else seemed to like him, there had been a thing in a paper about a civil war in what had a few years before been a British colony in Africa. Beale had remarked with some relish, "What do you expect, another lot who didn't know when they were better off?" George had protested that it was surely better for people to rule themselves badly than be ruled by other people. Also, he had tried to talk about the slaughter and destruction that had occurred when the territory had been taken over back in the last century. No one really agreed. No one really listened. Later, on the way home, Beale had cornered him and said casually, "Why don't you do yourself and everyone else a favor? You know what I mean? Why don't you?" And walked away whistling. He couldn't go back. He needed the new book. Now he saw an abyss opening. He had recently discovered an unfortunate taste for nasty, cheap gin. The cheap spirit-fueled drunk is perhaps the worst one to get a liking for. He had left Henshaw's house, staggered back through the snow to his hotel room. It was one of those really snow-filled mid-70s winter nights. When he reached his room, he carried on drinking. Somehow he found himself in the bathroom, looking at his stupid, tear-streaked face in the mirror, and he found himself repeating her name, Vipsania, again and again. He knew he had found her. Even now it still filled him with pride. In a small but significant way, it would change the world. And he found himself making strange shapes he didn't try to understand on the surface of the glass with his fingers. And he went on weeping and saying her name. Outside it was now full dark. The moon had risen. It started to snow again. Still mumbling her name, clutching the bottle, George put on his coat and staggered from the room. Swigging gulps of booze, he staggered along. It was very late. He couldn't remember how he had got past reception, or even if anyone had been on duty, never mind leaving the building. He found himself completely alone beside one of the city parks. It was one of those places where there's just a low stone wall you could easily step over, the original wrought iron of the fence that had once stood on this, long gone, like so many in the UK during the war. The thick blanket of snow undulated over what were undoubtedly low, easy landscaped slopes, unbroken and silvery in the moonlight. It looked to George a bit like low white clouds seen from above had settled on the earth. He laughed a bitter laugh. He had been brought down to earth. Then it seemed the illusion was complete, for the jagged topmost peak of an alp of raw living rock, ice rather than snow encrusted, rose stark and savage above and from the snow that looked like clouds. For a moment a terrible sense of vertigo swept him, for he stood almost level with this summit, as if he stood impossibly high above the earth. It was easy walking distance away, and in the moonlight he could see black cowled figures moving on the peak, clearly seen against the white. He had no choice. George began to walk forward. He knew there were 7 of them. There was also something that glinted in the moon's shimmer like glass. He let the bottle drop into the snow. As he approached, they pulled their hoods back so he could see. Ruined faces of blackened revenants. They were dwarf-like because their legs had been taken long ago. They had no tongues, so they made mewling guttural noises as they raised and lowered withered arms, the right ones of which ended in blackened stumps, raised and lowered them towards what was wedged half upright in a kind of cleft in the rock, raised and lowered their arms and mewed in both praise and lamentation, the 7 priests who had fled with her. No matter which way they swayed and turned, 7 twin moons were reflected in one eye, the other empty and ghastly. The thing among the rock glinted dull in the moonlight, a coffin of the kind of the opaque glass the Romans had sometimes used. Inside it there has an unmistakable shape. The dead things wriggled towards it. It brought into George's mind images of maggots. For a moment he imagined crippled sea lions. Some of them turned to him and grinned. They were very deft and gentle when they lifted away and laid down the lid. Vipsania did not so much rise as flow feet first from the coffin and stood before him. Clad in a simple shift of pure white, her form was so lovely that all other women were like marionettes in comparison. Despite what had been done to her, she had the most beautiful face he had ever seen. Her skin was white as snow. Her mouth gaped horribly open. With no surprise, he saw it was stuffed with what he knew was an apple of baked red painted clay. Despite this, she spoke to him clearly. "Do not be afraid, George. For tonight is your wedding night. I am indeed she who you say I was, and she I also became. Not least because in some ways it never really happened, although you were also right that this is the story my enemies imagined. I am indeed the seed and the root of that story. I am more real, more powerful for that very reason, but I am also for like reasons the seed and the root of another story. Yet I am not." She gave a beautiful musical and completely inhuman laugh, reached out and caressed George's face with her cold hands. "Can you guess what story it is, George?" George could guess. Every part of him began to shake, not with cold. Vipsania of Alexandria reached up and pulled the flesh of her own cheek impossibly to one side. With the other she plucked the clay apple from her mouth. George saw what big red eyes she had, and the long teeth. Cobra. Fast she kissed him. On the 3rd night the vampire rose. It slid from beneath the tree it had been buried under and through the snow. It made no disturbance, left no footprints. It decided it was going to pay a visit to Andrew Henshaw. It need only knock and say it was George. When invited in, it could then come and go as it pleased. Over the next few weeks, Henshaw would be less and less the strong young man he was. It hoped Mary would be there tonight, with senses that are thankfully nameless. It smiled when it saw she would be. Decided it would not be sleeping alone under its tree when the sun came. It was already flowing away like mist when it sensed the ghost, and knew who the ghost was. It reformed and stood hissing at the old man in a tattered robe who bared its path. The old man wore sandals and leaned heavily on a staff. Like it, he of course left no footprints. He had vivid green eyes and a peculiar pointed chin. The old ghost spoke kindly to it, quietly. "For reasons of my own, I will not allow you to go to his house. He must be as he is now for when he has another visitor, in another place, at another time." The old ghost shook its head, pausing. "Know, unfortunate abomination, that the man whose ruin thou art was one of the great sages of the world. He should have belonged to the ages. He did not deserve this fate. Go to sleep now." The old man touched the vampire with his staff. For just a moment there was another expression on its face. It collapsed, an inert mass of dead flesh. No one ever found George in the place under the tree, where he was gently laid. The story of Blood and Snow tells of George's rise and fall, highlighting the impact of unrelenting ambition. George's friendship with Henshaw begins with promise and mutual respect, but deteriorates as George becomes consumed by his discoveries. His eventual transformation into a vampire symbolizes the loss of his humanity and the devastating consequences of his obsession. This tale serves as a powerful reminder of the need for balance in life and the potential dangers of allowing our passions to overtake us. That's all for today. This is Nigel Watson, and you have been watching Tales from the Cryptkeeper, where AI meets unspeakable horrors.